The relations between lord and servant are faithfully portrayed by Madame Calderon de la Barca. Speaking of life in a hacienda, she describes how the lady of the house sat at the piano, while the employees and servants performed the typical dances of the country for the benefit of guests and relatives, without suggesting any ideas of equality or disrespect, more or less in the fashion of the Middle Ages, when the lord and the lady of the manor sat at table with their servants, though the latter remained rigorously below the salt. With regard to the lower classes, Madame Calderon always sees the picturesque side of things, which she describes vividly and colorfully. It is to be regretted, particularly from a Mexican point of view, that Fanny Ingles or editor should have thought it expedient only to give the first and last letters of the names of the more prominent persons of whom she speaks, a system which makes it difficult for a reader of later days to identify them, except in one or two cases. Many were the intimate friends of the Calderons, but especially the Conde de la Cortina, a well-known figure in society and in literary and scientific circles, the Marquis and Marquesa de Vivanco, and the Guerra Rodriguez, the fair Rodriguez, a celebrated beauty of her time, who is said to have been greatly admired by no less a person than Alexander von Humboldt himself. Naturally enough, Madame Calderon was a competent judge of her own sex, and was alert to the good qualities as well as to the foibles of the ladies of Mexico, whose excessive fondness for diamonds and, in some cases, too showy dresses elicit her mild criticism. Monastic life was one of the features of Mexico at that time. Most cities, large and small, were full of churches, monasteries, and convents, and Madame Calderon, who became a Catholic 3 years later, was not then well acquainted with the ceremonies and liturgy of the church, and consequently falls into many errors on the subject; but when she describes her visit to a convent and the ceremony of the veiling of a nun, she writes some of her most picturesque and touching pages. Madame Calderon does not stint her admiration for the great buildings of the country, both civil and religious, though her descriptions betray only too often the influence of the romantic age in which she lived. Beautiful indeed as is her description of a garden in Tulansingo, she rises to real eloquence before some of nature's pageants, admiring a sunset over the monastery of San Fernando, walking under the shade of the centennial trees of Chalputepec, or wandering within the gigantic caverns of Cacaomilpa, the recollection of which, she says, rests upon the mind like a marble dream, and where an unfortunate traveller, years before, had lost his way and met a tragic death. Prescott's statement that Madame Calderon's letters were not intended originally for publication seems hardly credible, but, on the other hand, there is no proof for the suggestion that she had the letters of Madame d'Aulnoy in mind. Be that as it may, the fact is that just as the French Countess has left us a living picture of Spain in the late 17th century, in the same way the wife of the Spanish Minister drew a most faithful pen portrait of the social, political, and even economic order in Mexico in the early 19th. As to Madame Calderon de la Barca's personal appearance, since a portrait of her, which is said to exist in the possession of a relative, has never been published, the reader is free to imagine that lively lady as it may best suit his or her individual fancy. That she was clever, well read, and an excellent judge of character, as well as a true lover of nature and a keen observer of manners and customs, is evident in her letters, which constitute by common consent a most entertaining and truly delectable narrative, which even the lapse of more than a century has not been able to mar. Preface. The present work is the result of observations made during a 2 years' residence in Mexico, by a lady whose position there made her intimately acquainted with its society, and opened to her the best sources of information in regard to whatever could interest an enlightened foreigner. It consists of letters, written to the members of her own family, and really not intended originally, however incredible the assertion, for publication. Feeling a regret that such rich stores of instruction and amusement, from which I have so much profited myself, should be reserved for the eyes of a few friends only, I strongly recommended that they should be given to the world. This is now done, with a few such alterations and omissions as were necessary in a private correspondence, and although the work should derive more credit from the author's own name than from anything which I can say, yet as she declines prefixing it, I feel much pleasure in making the statement by way of introduction to the public. William H. Prescott, Boston, December 20, 1842. End of Preface. End of Introduction of Life in Mexico.